And now, episode 2 of the Whiskey and Cigarettes podcast with your host, Tina Kilberg, sponsored by 96 MFK, Hit Radio Los Angeles, Viceroy Cigarette. Okay,
and
fine.
Tim
And of course, Spania tanning butter for that deeper, faster Hawaiian tan.
These sessions, Tim, are so valuable to me that, God forbid, we spend an hour and a half saying the greatest things and I can't take any of it away with me when it comes to writing and making notes and stuff because I haven't saved anything. So it's really important for us to just preserve as much as possible. So if we jump right in and talk about why this series matters, I think, I think people that have maybe at least kept up with us in our discussions and rants know that this is, in short, a limited series that explores Terry Melcher's life beyond the Manson narrative, his impact on California's sound, relationships with music icons, and personal struggles. But I think something that we can both agree on is that the intention behind this screenplay is to being more nuanced, to an era that's been oversimplified and overtaken by a tiny fragment of true crime, particularly relating to the events of August 9th, 1969.
That's correct. I absolutely agree. And is people who don't know, and our last video got over 1,000 views so far, which is encouraging.
Most of my views get 1 to 3K. Because thanks to that CLO drive analyzing the history of the home, I think it's ever since I posted that video, I just kept getting more views on my
It's at like 18,000 now.
Average, yeah, that was 18K. So on average, I do get natural views, not paid for, 1 to 3K for the rest of my videos, thanks to that, which is quite good.
Well, sorry, to respond to that, what you said, if you wanted me to respond to that. Yes, it is. It's exactly right. It's for people who don't know, this has been in the works a long time. I mean, you wrote this before we met, and we've been talking about it for almost 4 years now. So it's a long time coming. So it's just so happening that it's kind of coming together now. But I was thinking about this, and I think, it's been dominated by the true crime narrative. They were victims. It's like when in the Sebring documentary, Quentin Tarantino's interviewed for that. And it was right when he was filming Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. He was filmed inside actually Jay's old salon on Fairfax Avenue. And he said, whenever anybody does anything that involves the Manson family in any way, tangentially or as a focus, it automatically becomes the Charlie and the Family show. And everybody else is lost. And his point was, his movie was not really what that was about. And that's kind of for us. This is not what that's about. This is about the lives of the people beyond that, which, like we said last time, are interesting in and of themselves, independent of any way that they ended. Now, we can't avoid it, obviously. When you talk about this, you have to talk about it because it's like you're ignoring the elephant in the room. You can't pretend it didn't happen, but it doesn't have to be the focus. And I think that was your goal all along.
Well, it's not just that. It's also that I think what I'm trying to do, which is something that nobody has really attempted to do before, is actually show Charles Manson as the man that people knew, the people that actually knew him, who was an outsider exploring the industry politics and how all he wanted was to just be a musician, a famous musician. But here's the thing about fame, which was what Charles Manson was chasing so badly. Fame is more than just wanting to be seen. It's about sharing your energy with lots of people, with millions of people, and having that sort of impact. And he couldn't do that even if he tried. No. And murder wasn't just enough for him. He had to get back. He had to commit murder. He had to murder a famous person and be associated with that name. I feel like there's a different type of, I want to get into that a bit later. But before we move forward, if we go back to Terry Melcher is often mentioned in relation to Charles Manson, but his contributions to music and the industry deserve greater recognition. And I mean, all it takes is a Google search. Google search news. If you go on Google search news and write Terry Melcher, I'm telling you right now, they may reproduce articles every few months, but it more or less has to do with his connection to Dennis Wilson and how he knew Charles Manson, or briefly associated with the Byrds or Doris Day. That's about it.
Exactly. Yep. And I've mentioned this to people, selective people over here. And if they know that name at all, if they know Terry's name at all, the only thing they know about him is, oh, he was the Manson guy. Or if it's a real stretch, oh, he was Doris Day's son. Most people don't even know that. If they know the name at all, they'll just go, oh, wasn't that the guy who knew Manson? There's nothing beyond that. And it's really sad, because I think the further we get away from this time-wise, like we're coming up on 60 years as to when all this stuff happened, 50 to 60 years, depending on what year you're talking about. The further we get away from it, the greater chance that these people's stories is going to be forgotten. That we're not going to know them.
And I think this is why we should tell this story now, because I think that's a big question. And in terms of pitching the script at some point, I'm going to have to talk about this. And, why tell the story now? Well, in simple terms, it's about there's an importance here in setting the record straight and giving a fresh perspective on things.
Absolutely.
But a question that I keep, well, not a question, more of a warning that I keep getting from so many people is, oh, you have to protect your script. Don't let anyone steal your idea. Listen, anyone can go and do research and gather research on this guy, Terry Melcher, and produce a script. And I'm pretty sure that there's experienced film and TV screenwriters and a team who could go about doing this and do intense research, just as I have to write this. But the reason why I was never worried of people stealing this idea is because if Hollywood wanted to make a biopic about Terry Melcher, they already would have. And there isn't even a documentary that's centered around his life.
No, not really.
I'd actually be interested. So I'm not worried about anyone. They would have already done it by now. And
he's only tangentially mentioned in documentaries about the music of that time. As good as some of them are,
that's true.
Terry's name is rarely brought up. And I don't know if that's a deliberate thing on the part of the family, because they just don't want that out there, which is completely understandable, because they're probably afraid, or they just don't want to deal with the Manson connection anymore, which is completely understandable. The same thing with all the families of the victims who are still around. They just don't want to deal with it because they've been dealing with it forever. And again, people know them as like, oh yeah, the Manson guy. No, this is the guy who had 80 hit records for Columbia, 80 charting singles that he produced for Columbia in his career. You never hear people talk about that.
And I think, one of the Terry was the first US sub-publisher for the Beatles.
Which you also...
This is a major and yet overlooked role in their American breakthrough, but no one wants to talk about it.
Well, the money is in the true crime, unfortunately. And we've seen it exploited basically ever since it happened. I mean, the first thing that I think really came out about this was, of course, Helter Skelter, the book, and which is a valuable resource. I'm glad it's out there. And then Vince, turned around and basically sold the rights to make the movie. 2 movies, actually. There was one that came out. It was more of a crime documentary kind of thing, but it did have actors in it. The first Helter Skelter came out in like 75. And I think it was redone in like 2003 or 4. So,
I believe 75 was the one where they showed the Manson trials. Was that it?
Yeah, it was more actual footage than actors performing.
I'm going to be honest. I briefly, around 2021, I know exactly what you're talking about. I found the casting a bit awful. There was another 70s film that came out that had a different name.
There's been a lot of them. I mean, they all just deal with the
first depictions. Firstly, there was an actress that portrayed, what's her name? The redhead girl that didn't commit the crimes.
Squeaky Fromme?
No, not her. The other girl.
What didn't commit the crimes?
Yes.
Sandra Good?
No, there's another girl that she collaborated with Vincent, and was a star witness for the trial.
Kasabian? Linda Kasabian.
That's her.
Basically, that whole case.
The girl that portrayed her, her appearance wise, I want to say she kind of emulated Sharon Tate.
Okay, that's a good point. That's a really good point.
You know which one I'm talking about?
Yes, that's Linda Kasabian, who she was portraying. But that's a good point.
Yeah.
The way and there's been so many ripoffs of this story, and they just all go for the crime narrative, which is disgusting. Like I said last time, if it were us, how would we feel if people did that to our family? Okay, so if you look at the way these things have been cast, from the very early ones to like Aquarius, the limited series, which production wise that was really well done, but again it was all about the crime narrative, and then Charlie Says and The Haunting of Sharon Tate and all this really trashy stuff. The way they cast the family members, they all look like models. They cast the Charlie as some like 6-foot model dude. He was 5 foot dude.
Girls, yeah.
He was a gutter rat. He was a horrible little person. And they cast model types to look like him. The girls all look like models. You know, if they actually looked like models in real life, you could understand why all these biker dudes would hang around there. But they were infested with diseases. They were drug addicts. They were a mess. If you look at pictures of like the girls from Trial, they look horrendous. You know,
I'm going
nutritionally starved, bad shape. But in the film, they cast them as models.
I agree, and I think I'm trying to find what you're referring to right now. I cannot find it. There's a 1978 film about the Manson crimes, Helter Skelter, because I thought there was. I know the 2004 one, and the other one.
Maybe 78 was the first one based off the book. Maybe it was 78.
The thing is, there's another film that wasn't called Helter Skelter. It was called like The Dark Side of Something. Like,
oh, there's so many of them. I don't know. It's obscene how many there are. It's obscene. Really.
I'm gonna have to get back and find this film because I've actually seen it. It's not 19. I'm pretty convinced it was in 1978, and the fact that I'm only finding Helter Skelter from 1978 is frustrating. But there was another film. I mean, there's a lot of them. There still is.
Yep.
But here's the thing. And I think, unfortunately, I think what's important with this series that we're trying to make is examining the myth versus the reality of the 60s, because the 60s wasn't just free love, rock and roll, peace and love.
No.
The industry was cutthroat. Artists were exploited. Charles Manson wrote a song, Cease to Desist. No, Cease
Exist. Okay, yeah, that's true.
Cease to Exist, which the Beach Boys eventually turned to Never Learn Not to Love.
Right, and the songwriting credit went to Dennis Wilson, but that was actually his fault for not knowing how the business worked. He didn't insist on it.
Actually didn't want. Well, I looked into it, and Charlie did not want a credit. He just wanted money.
Okay, well, that was again. Okay, that goes back to making a rookie mistake, and why he was never going to be a signed musician because he wasn't a professional. They brought him into the studio. They tried to, and I don't want to make this whole thing about him because it's obscene, but for that point only, he recorded demos with Dennis Wilson, and he acted like an idiot in the studio, cracking jokes, couldn't focus, couldn't get the microphone set up right. He was never going to be recorded by a professional like Columbia Records and Terry Melcher. He was mentally disturbed for whatever reason. He was institutionalized. He wasn't going to be a professional musician ever. And if he knew about the business, even way back then, he would have insisted on intellectual property protection, not just getting a one-time payment. That's a rookie mistake, and one that a professional wouldn't have made.
I also don't think that Charles Manson actually wanted to be a musician because he loved music.
No.
I just think it was his partner in crime, should I say. Music was his partner in crime, strumming his guitar, singing songs, because he spent so much of his early life in prison. And that was his company. And, you know, I think with him, the problem is that Charles Manson was so obsessed with fame that, like I mentioned earlier, murder alone wasn't enough. He had to murder someone famous, someone from the elite, to be associated with the elite. And this kind of reminds me of John Lennon. The guy that killed him, who was like a paparazzi or a photographer. Yeah. He was so obsessed with him, Tim, that he was stalking him for days or even hours around the time of his death when he was shot. When he was shot in New York City, and I believe the reasoning was something about the line, something about, like, it was something along the, I can't quote for sure, but something along the lines of, oh, he didn't like how famous he got, John, and that's why.
Yeah, that's a whole other thing. And John, I mean, I
Yeah.
just read a book about this too. We All Shine On by Elliot Mintz. Great book about John's life at that time. He walked around New York City with no bodyguards, no protection. And as he was a Beatle, I mean, you're one of the most famous people on the planet. And even in the 70s, New York was gritty and pretty dangerous when he lived there. And he would just go out for walks with no protection. Going back to your point about the 60s and how it was way too free and easy then. And everything, hindsight's always 2020. We can look back and see the problems. It was too easy for some outsider on the dark part of LA culture like Manson to get close to people like Dennis Wilson. Today, it's unimaginable. Dennis Wilson, someone of that level, would have bodyguards, would never go out alone, would be driven everywhere probably. He would never get close to somebody like that today. So it was really free and easy. It was way too easy for the dark side of the culture to intermingle with famous people. And it happened all the time. And in that, especially those of us who weren't alive for it, it's a fascinating time. But the tendency is to kind of romanticize it. And there was a lot of bad stuff going on back then. I mean, the racism, the sexism, the behavior in the office places where men were just allowed to hit on women with free reign and no repercussions, and just horrible things they would say to the drinking, the smoking, all the stuff, just chain smoking, binge drinking was all part of society. And that was not good looking back on it. And then with that came the proximity of crazy people to famous people. No security, no cameras, no bodyguards. There were problems back then. A lot of the Vietnam War, which fueled so much of that good music that we always talk about. It wasn't all sunshine and rainbows at all.
But also the dark explorations that you can come about and discover, the more you look into like all of these people and personalities and the band members and everyone, is that like there's so much darkness within the nature of the industry even back then, which is so interesting, because the California dream, or the American dream rather, having that lifestyle over there, it had a dark side. And all of these success stories, ranging from the Byrds to the Beach Boys, if you look at them, very closely, or should I say rather the Mamas and the Papas, because things get really dark if you look into them and their lives and look into things about them.
Especially later on, yeah.
Yeah, so these success stories for these particular personalities that we're exploring, they often masked personal struggles and drugs that were largely influenced by the industry politics. Because if you're an entertainer at this time, or at any time, but particularly now, it all begins and ends with your identity, which was Charlie's problem. And what you bring to this world, your inherent value, especially around these circles of people, is dependent on these things. And that's why Charles Manson wouldn't have managed to handle being famous, because it's about dealing with mass amount of crowds, sharing your energy with all these people.
Could you imagine that guy on a stage performing in front of people?
He wouldn't handle it.
No way. There's
Tim,
no way.
He wouldn't handle it.
No, there's no way. And it's just
mental health issues. He was on drugs, and I also think that musicians are very sensitive and vulnerable by nature, and they should not take drugs. Because
here's the thing too about that, why he even thought that he could get a recording contract. And again, I don't want to dwell on him because but it is part of the story. So back then, especially in LA in the 60s, when the center of the music world moved from New York City to LA, the business was run, as far as I understand it, by music people, meaning the people in charge, the producers, were music guys. People who loved music first and foremost and were willing to take a chance on people. So it was theoretically possible for an unknown to walk into Capitol Records, say, and meet with somebody and possibly arrange a demo recording session. That's unthinkable now. But because the business was run by music-oriented people back then, and not just corporations with eyes on the bottom line only, first and foremost, it's theoretically possible that some unknown could go in and record a demo and then possibly make a record. It was run by people like Lou Adler, like Mo Austin, like Ahmet Ertegun, guys who love music. It's not really that way anymore. So today, he would not even have a chance in hell to record a demo for a major label. It just wouldn't.
You know what you're reminding me of? I'm trying to find it right now. I'm trying to find the exact quote. Unfortunately, I can't find the quote. I can find the scene that I wrote in the script where Doris Day refuses Charlie a record deal.
Yes, yeah.
And she says, I can't find it. I can only find the script. I'm hoping that I'm quoting it word for word.
It was something, I know what you mean. Yeah, it was something like, you must be out of your mind if you think I'm going to give you a record deal. She was not flattering, let's say.
Yeah. She says, you're out of your mind if you think I'm going to give you an effing record deal. I can't find the exact quote, but that's what I was.
It's something like that. You're right.
Instantly reminded me of Doris Day telling Charles Manson to bugger off. Basically, I can't find it, but
and, you know, she was a legend. She was a royalty. She knew her way around that business. She knew there was no way someone like that was ever going to be a professional recording musician.
Yeah.
If he hadn't chanced upon Dennis Wilson, and if Dennis Wilson hadn't been such a trusting, nice guy, he never would have met Terry Melcher, ever. So, like, back to your, I'm not sure what the next bullet point you have is if you want to move on, but yeah, there is that disconnect between romanticizing the era and how it really was. Now, it was very cool in a lot of ways. It was in a lot of ways the free and easy part was cool because it gave rise to some incredible music and film. But there was that dark side, yeah, and it's just there was no separation. It was too easy for someone crazy like that and dangerous to get into that world. And the world has never been the same since, really. It was never that free and easy before. It's never been that free and easy since.
And, you know, like, also, I feel that I'm sure what's good about the series is that there are a lot of bands that we're exploring, which means that it could potentially attract the fan base of, you know, the Byrds, the Beach Boys, Paul Revere, and the Raiders. And unfortunately, aside from my research and the reason why it's been quite challenging for me to rewrite and a lot of the scenes for episode 1 in terms of developing the Byrds is because I'm not a fan of the Byrds and that I didn't actually listen to them, knew much about them. In fact, I didn't know about them at all until I started researching Terry and looked at the work that he did, because I would have an obligation to just portray them in the best light and not offend any of the fans. But that's quite difficult for me to do because when I'm looking at the script firsthand and I'm just seeing it as an outsider, I'm seeing Terry Melcher, who is a young Columbia recruit. He's a rookie, and the Columbia staff and managers aren't trusting him because he's young. They know he got in through his networks, given that his mother was Doris Day. He was in his early 20s, and he decided to take on a band that couldn't perform. And
well, they could sing, but he felt, and that was
they couldn't play any of their music, and Terry had to bring in the wrecking crew to conduct the background.
It's as far as it's not that they couldn't play. I mean, they could play, particularly Roger McGuinn, who did play, like we talked about.
Only Roger, though. The rest
on the single. It's not that they couldn't play. It's that Terry thought that he wanted that Mr. Tambourine Man to be a single. He saw dollar signs on that and knew it could be a hit if they did it the way they did it. So to increase the chances of that becoming a hit, he wanted to take as many precautions as possible and make sure he got the best recording possible. So he used the Wrecking Crew people. And they appeared on, they're the unsung heroes of California Sound because they appeared on just about any record you can think of from that era in some form or another. That core group of musicians, those 20 or 15, 20 people that don't get mentioned enough. Tommy Tedesco, Carol Kay, Glenn Campbell, Hal Blaine, this core group of musicians that appeared on everything. And they were so busy. And yeah, on the other songs, I could be wrong, but on the other songs on the first record, the Byrds themselves did play on some of it. And then by the second record, Turn, 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 they were playing on most everything. And
which is a huge improvement. But that in itself, to cover the first episode, there's tension already going on between Terry, who has been assigned to them.
Right.
And he has to convince Columbia Records that the band isn't ready yet. We have to bring session musicians in. If you look at interviews years later, Terry says he eventually got fired by the Byrds for refusing to get high with them.
That I don't know. You're the only one who's ever said that part of it.
Yeah, it's
which
from
could
a
be
recorded interview.
okay.
Given by Terry himself.
He came back in the 70s and did a couple other records for them. He did one called Bird Maniacs, I think, that was like the early 70s.
Yeah. But
produced,
we're looking at 1965 to 1966, like the
right.
very first, having a responsibility to take this band, young amateurs, and bring in session musicians, improve them, build them, be smart in your moves. So not just bring in the Wrecking Crew, but decide to take 2 Bob Dylan songs that have been already well known, loved, appreciated, doing remake versions in order for them to be a success, getting them on the top 100 Billboard within a year, managing to do that. And it's amazing how between the 2 vinyls, from Mr. Tambourine Man and Turn, 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 if you actually compare the 2, seeing a vast improvement within months on how the boys got better.
Oh, sure.
Amazing to explore. But I think what's very interesting is that I don't want to delve into the bad stuff, because if I'm just seeing it from an outsider, I'm just seeing it as a band that's inexperienced, not too good, and they had to get support, and they ended up actually having a manager who fired Terry, and he wanted his position in a way. So the Byrds received all the help they needed to be a success from Terry, and then ended up turning away from him.
I think Terry really kind of shaped their sound. They were very talented. Their harmonies were incredible. McGuinn is an incredible guitar player to this day. And Gene Clark was a good guitar player in his own right. Gene wrote some really great songs. Gene was really the songwriter of that group. So he ended up making more money than a lot of the other ones.
You know what I love about McGuinn? I love the fact that, like Roger, I love the fact that he changed his name to Roger in 1967.
It was early. I can't remember exactly when. Yeah.
And he was referred to Jim McGuinn. And I wanted to find out why this was the case. And it was because he was convinced. How hippie sounding does this sound? He was convinced by spiritual advisors that Roger would vibrate more positively within the universe.
Well, it was the 60s, man,
But I think that could take a dark turn in itself. Like, that in itself sounds beautiful if you think about it, but it could take a dark turn if you add substance abuse and the Manson narrative and Charlie chanting Manson, son of man, and convincing his followers he was a messiah of some sort. So I think
that was his real talent.
Dark turn.
His real talent, manipulating broken people. That's it.
Yeah.
He was not a guru. He was not a Svengali. He could manipulate broken people. Not an insignificant skill. But to go back to the Byrds, like we were emailing privately, they had a lot of talent. And had they not existed, there may have been no California sound. They really kind of kicked it off. There was a lot of talent there. And we go back and talk about David Crosby. David Crosby is a contentious figure. And he's admitted in multiple interviews that he was really difficult to get along with, especially back then. But David Crosby was insanely talented. His solo records, he put out a bunch before he died, probably 3 or 4, maybe 5 in the last 6 or 7 years of his life. They're beautifully done. And he was over 75, 80 years old when he put these out. He had these weird guitar tunings, kind of like Joni Mitchell. It'd be just weird ways to tune a guitar, and incredible voice, incredible harmonies, even late into his life. His last record is incredibly beautiful. His first record's beautiful.
I had to double check because you just said he died, and he died in January 2023. He was alive when I started writing, so I kind of got confused there.
That's why watching his documentary is a good idea.
I could see his tweets.
Yeah, he was a difficult guy. He didn't suffer fools easily, and he was not afraid to.
That's crazy. The more I'm writing the script, the more people are dying. I mean, Quincy Jones died.
The sad thing is, I mean, as well, the people we're talking about now are in their.
Olivia Hussey died. Like
Yeah.
all these people are suddenly dying.
Well, I
Oh,
mean, they're in their 80s. I mean, if you look at the
yeah.
ones who are still around musically, the ones who are still alive and performing, Roger McGuinn still plays, Stephen Stills, Graham Nash, Neil Young, all still write and record and perform music.
Mark
Joni
Lindsay's
Mitchell's still
alive, right?
alive.
Alive. Okay, good.
Uh,
Mark Lindsay's still alive.
Mark Lindsay's still alive, of course. Yeah, Mark. My God.
And the
And
guys from Paul Revere and the Raiders, you guys can't go away. Please
Paul
don't go.
Revere. Paul Revere died about 10 years ago. The keyboardist.
Yeah, yeah.
And funny thing about Paul Revere and the Raiders, the band, according to another YouTube channel, his name is Matt Williamson. He runs this channel called Pop Goes the 60s. It's an incredible channel.
Matt
He's
Williams.
like Pop Goes the 60s by Matt Williamson. He's like a professor of 60s music. So thorough. And he said on one of his videos that the band that had the most hits between 1961 and 1971 was Paul Revere and the Raiders. It wasn't the Beatles. It was Paul Revere and the Raiders. And of course, Terry was crucial to their sound. He worked with them for years and years, well into their career. So he was really responsible for shaping what they became. And they don't get talked enough about as the hit makers that they were. I mean, they had some really good tunes, especially in the mid '60s. Those first few records, those were incredible.
I agree. I agree.
And this is the stuff people don't talk about with Terry. You know, this is interesting stuff.
Of course it is. It's shaping music, the industry.
Yes, exactly.
And it's not just that. Terry's such a character in his own way. The Melcher stash, which we've coined the Melcher stash.
Yeah, it was a look.
I mean, I know that that's very 70s and 60s, but it's just, I don't know. I think it's nice, but it's not just about Terry. It's about different guys. You know, we could go off on a segment and talk about Jay, you know, redefining men's hairstyling in Hollywood. I remember, I don't know if you've seen this, if I've sent it to you, but there was like a press newspaper thing with a headline that said, "Would you pay $50?"
Oh, sure. Yeah, that's pretty well known.
And did you know
that was in 60s money? That was in 60s money. So now it would be more like 400.
Did you know, I had to check this to confirm, did you know that so he charged $50 per haircut.
In the beginning, then it got even bigger. Yeah.
Yeah. But this was in an era, Tim, where at the time, most barbers charged $2.50.
Right. They also,
I thought they were charged at least $20. $2.
No, well, no, because back then, if you consider that in the early 60s, money is roughly, it's whatever the dollar figure, it's 10 times more now, roughly. So if you're looking at like 1961, when Jay really became prominent, and barbers were charging $2, that's like $20. That's about standard. That's today it's on the cheap end, but that would be believable. When he really got going, the movie stars were paying him thousands. Frank Sinatra flew him to Las Vegas when he was there every few weeks to cut his hair, covering expenses.
But you know what helped with that? Jay was really smart about that, because it wasn't just a matter of Jay networking with people. He created the Sebring method.
Oh, he was an entrepreneur. He was
method, and by providing precision in the hairstyling techniques for people like Steve McQueen or Marlon Brando.
That was one of the first. Yeah, Warren Beatty.
It was about creating the Sebring method, and I think that's what helped him attract all these clients and be.
Did you see the documentary yet or not yet?
I haven't watched the documentary, and the reason for that being is because I don't want to focus so much on Jay currently, because I just have to get the scenes done for the Byrds. There's I just have to I'm focusing on episode 1 again, and I have to really focus on portraying the Byrds in a good light, not in a way that disrespects them in any shape or form. I do want to show their limits, of course, and how they weren't prepared, and show more of the tension as to what Terry had to do to convince the guys at Columbia that he was preparing for the best by working with the Byrds.
Do you know the story? I don't know if you want to work coming up on 30.
I'm not watching the documentary anytime soon, because I have to get all these scenes covered.
I think in time we should devote episodes to each episode. We should have one episode at least for the principal. So one just about Terry, one just about Sharon, and one just about Jay. We could easily do that in time. We're coming
Yeah.
up on 35 minutes. I don't know if you want to stop and do this and start again, or just keep going. What do you
I think it's best to save it.
Okay.
Save it, and then it'll just be easier for uploading as well.
Okay, so we can leave and then come back in a couple.
Dig deeper. We'll dig deeper and the hidden stories and personalities and stuff for part 2, because there is something that we need to talk about, Tim, and it's the El Coyote myth. So we're gonna save that.
Oh boy, how much time do you want to spend on that mess? Okay.
Well, I'm gonna give it all to you because I think you're gonna provide the best timeline for this. So we
okay. Wow. All right, we'll try to untangle that. Okay, that's okay. We'll leave and come back for part 2.
All right.